James Brown, our regular international and security expert, joins me. James, what do you make of some of those remarks by Paul Keating that the subtleties of foreign policy right now are lost in this country?
Well, some classic Paul Keating there, particularly like that line about the belching of do-gooder journalists being fed leaks from the security agencies. I mean, I think you have to acknowledge Paul Keating's deep expertise on Asia. You also have to acknowledge his commercial linkages to China and his role on the China Development Bank as well. There's a lot to disagree with in that speech. I agree with his points about the weakening of regional institutions. I wouldn't agree with his caricature of US national strategy as being about containing China or looking for military adventurism on the Asian mainland. And I wouldn't agree with his strong view that China's economic and military dominance is all but assured. I mean, we're seeing a lot of challenges to that narrative. But I mean, Paul Keating basically says for Australia there's two options. We can either try to engage with China and shape where they're going, accepting that they're going to have a large role in the world and the region, or we can bunker down. Well, the first one hasn't worked, and why would we pursue the second one? Why wouldn't we look to band together with other democracies and other allies? In Paul Keating's eyes, the fact that countries are democracies or communist authoritarian states doesn't really matter. He's pushing a very hard realist version of the world, and really, I mean, still very much making the point that the security agencies in Australia aren't to be trusted and shouldn't be listened to when it comes to shaping our foreign policy.
I think as well, though, when he says that it lacks strategic realism, but you know, you look at his prime ministership, it was something that he focused on as well at that time, was a strategic realism, to be fair to him.
Yeah, look, I think you could argue that that has not, I mean, we haven't seen a hard realist edge in a lot of the foreign policy announcements made by the Morrison government. We've seen some discussion about values in foreign policy. We've seen some discussion about reshaping of international trends, but you haven't seen a hard realism of the type that Keating's talking about. And he did show an ability to be quite realist in his thinking, particularly in his efforts when it came to setting up a comprehensive partnership with Indonesia. I mean, if you take that forward, it paints a very bleak picture for Australia, and it sort of ties into some of the arguments being made by others that Australian defence spending needs to go to at least 3% of GDP. We need a much more muscular defence force and foreign policy if we're really going to have to navigate this world that is, as Paul Keating described it this morning, sort of coming loose at the moorings.
He also said and quoted some US Cold War warriors in their view as well, that basically the US needs to cede any sense of dominance in Asia, that it's not going to be dominated either economically or in a security sense by a non-Asian power. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think his argument for that is a long-standing one. I think the US would accept that it doesn't dominate Asia in the way it, once used to have a significant influence over Asia's economic and strategic characteristic. And I think we need to be clear that that domination of Asia had some very beneficial characteristics. I mean, amongst which it created the sort of international relations scenario in which China could lead its economic rise. I don't think the US would claim that it dominates Asia today, but I think that's a long step from saying that China's dominance of the region is completely assured, both military and economically. We're seeing a changing balance of power in the region. We're seeing efforts by middle powers to band together. I mean, Paul Keating is very dismissive of the Quad, but I think there are significant shared strategic interests between India, Japan, Australia and the United States. Australia and Korea are starting to do more together. So this idea that, everyone should just sort of let China get on with it, don't worry about the fact that they're communist, certainly don't talk about ideological issues, don't be concerned that, those ideological issues might leak out of China's borders and everything will be okay in this sort of purely realist world. I don't think that provides much comfort or much of a foreign policy to Australian decision makers.
When you look at the current situation of criticism levelled at China and the fact that 2 Liberal MPs have been blocked from visiting, it's quite an achievement that China's secured here by uniting Richard Di Natale, Anthony Albanese and the Morrison government in criticising this decision.
Well, it's clearly an own goal for China and Australia. I mean, the suggestion that if you criticise China, you can't visit China, I don't think we would expect that. I mean, these are elected representatives of the Australian people who wanted to go to China to meet with them and understand their perspective. And if you need to essentially sign up to the company line before you can even have a conversation, that doesn't really suggest much respect for sovereignty of Australia or divergence of views. And, you know, we're seeing that increasingly from China, this sensitivity and prickliness about any degree of criticism. And that's because it's not really acceptable for China to have foreigners criticising the practices of their government. That's very different from our way of life and our way of politics, where if you're not criticising government, you're not really doing your job.
The chaos continues in Hong Kong as the pro-democracy protesters continue. So I guess it's a timely reminder of how many challenges China is facing right now. Obviously, this tension is one thing, but then you look at the criticism across the board out of the leak to the New York Times on Xinjiang and the detainment of and re-education of more than 1 million Uyghurs. That's one thing, but now this ongoing security issue. We've got live pictures from Hong Kong I want to show our viewers. It is really heating up once again. Special police apparently have been entering university precincts and targeting the student protesters once again. So on a number of different fronts, this power has got some issues right now, and Hong Kong is the most visible one on a day-to-day basis, as we see once again from these pictures coming out of that city, James.
Yeah, I mean, those Xinjiang papers that were released by the New York Times over the weekend are horrific. You look at some of the commentary in those Chinese official documents about how to deal with problems in Xinjiang province, instructions to local officials to round up everybody who needs to be rounded up, to talk about the disappearance of families into camps in such cold and clinical language. And then we see the impact of the Chinese system on Hong Kong. Remember, China promised that it would leave Hong Kong to be an autonomous place where people could enjoy political, civil, legislative freedoms. And now we're seeing quite horrific scenes, police having gone into, I think, the Polytechnic University in the last 10 minutes. We've seen some horrific violence over the last week, admittedly by both the Hong Kong police and by protesters. But this flies in the face of really what Paul Keating was saying this morning. I mean, how can it be that you can say that Chinese practices, Chinese political beliefs, the system of surveillance and detention that China is building will not leak out and have an influence on the rest of the world? We're seeing it happen in real time in Hong Kong right now.
James Brown, great to see you. We'll catch you later in the week.